It's really got to be a scientist to scientist, regulatory to regulatory conversation where everybody is confident that you're doing the right thing for the patient, notwithstanding the importance of also generating a medicine that will lead to profits, because if there's no market, there's no medicine.
Hello, and welcome to a very special episode of FDA Watch. I'm Wayne Pines, your host. Very excited about this particular episode. It's the second installment in another of our signature multi-episode series that we produce in collaboration with law firms and other organizations. This series, which we're calling Drug Pricing Pressure, Navigating Regulatory Complexity, looks at the intersection of FDA regulatory strategy, competition, antitrust scrutiny, enforcement risk, a whole bunch of issues involved with FDA and with the issue of drug pricing. Obviously, very complex issue. We have two support groups here today. One is White Case, well-known law firm, and its life sciences group. Secondly is BRG, which helps clients navigate financial compliance and transaction consequences of drug pricing pressure. So welcome representatives from both White Case and BRG. What we're looking at in this series is drug pricing within the FDA regulatory context. We are FDA Watch, so everything that we do is within the context of FDA. Historically, FDA has avoided anything having to do with drug prices. When I was there, we were almost trained to avoid even knowing about drug prices. Over the years, FDA has changed a little bit. It has advocated for more generics, more biosimilars, and those are obviously motivated by the cost of drugs, trying to reduce the overall cost of drugs within our healthcare system. FDA still doesn't get involved with setting any particular price for a drug, but it has expressed a concern about how pricing pressure changes real-world regulatory decision-making, how drug pricing can migrate into government investigations and enforcement, and how drug costs are involved with corporate transactions, licenses. Drug costs obviously remain front-page news. I just want to remind you, for those who missed the beginning of this series, we urge you to give it a listen. You can do that by going to fdawatch.net. In that case, we had Bethany Hills, Raul Rao from White Case, John Barquette from BRG, and they discussed government policy levers deployed to navigate drug pricing across agencies and Congress. Today, we're going to be doing a really deep dive into pricing as it involves the FDA. We have two great guests. Bethany is back. Bethany is a regulatory partner at White Case. Her practice integrates compliance, corporate governance, enforcement, cross-border transactional strategies. And as I said, Bethany was the guest on our first episode. So welcome back, Bethany. You must love this.
Great to be here, Wayne. Thanks for allowing me to come back again.
Dan Troy is our guest. I've known Dan for many decades. He's well recognized on an international basis as a healthcare lawyer. I first met him even before he became chief counsel of FDA, where he served with great distinction. He then moved on to become general counsel at GSK, to become a law firm partner, and he is now continues to be intimately involved in the entire drug industry. So it's great to see you again, Dan, and welcome to FDA Watch.
Thank you, Wayne. I do love the podcast, and I'm very honored and pleased to be on.
So I can't let you on, Dan, without starting out with a question that is not related to drug pricing, and that is, what is your overall take on what's going on at FDA? You were inside the agency. You've been an observer of the agency for many, many decades. What's your take?
Well, we can probably do a whole podcast on this, and certainly drug pricing is not irrelevant to what's been going on at the FDA. But I think Commissioner McCary had many good ideas, and when he spoke, I mostly agreed with what he said. But you need to respect and understand process, And you need to embody things in guidance or rules, as you know. And you live by the press release, you die by the press release. Just releasing a whole, number of great ideas is not a way to make lasting change. I mean, let's give one example. It may be that one pivotal trial is a really good idea as a default. But what's a sponsor supposed to do with the fact that it's now in a journal article by two people who are no longer at FDA? I mean, that's just not very helpful. And indeed, as you know, there's actually FDA regulation against what's called podium policy. If it's not in regs and not in guidance, it's not supposed to be the basis for decision making. Just to take one quick war story from my time, I think you may remember, Wayne, we did a couple of things when I was there, but one of them was I had the deputy secretary issue a letter saying that the Office of Chief Counsel was going to review warning letters and untitled letters, which I think is the right thing to do. If the government's going to accuse you of violating the law, I think the Office of Chief Counsel should review it. But because we didn't put that in the policies or procedures, the Obama administration disappeared that policy in a minute. But we also worked on this Orange Book rule, which we did an NPRM, we did a final. I worked with the staff on it. Liz Dickinson was vital to it. And that still informs the way the Orange Book process runs.
I think we'll continue to talk about what's been going on at FDA for a long time because obviously permanent change has come to the FDA as a consequence of what's been going on for the last 18 months or so. And a number of people think that the change was not necessarily for the better. I want to shift gears to talk about drug pricing. And again, with you, Dan, you were a major law firm. You were involved in this for a long time. How is a drug price set?
Before I became chief counsel, I was approached about whether I wanted to interview to be the general counsel of HHS. And I said no, because I never wanted to think about Medicare, Medicaid, or drug pricing because it was too complicated. And then I ended up as FDA chief counsel and, ironically, GSK general counsel. So I certainly needed to think about drug pricing. It's really complex. There's no one price. There are government prices. There's something called best price. The prices are negotiated with insurance plans. Then there are these rebates on top of that with PBMs. We're not going to get into all of that. But it's not a normal market. A very quick war story. When Andrew Whitty took over as CEO, he decided to run the U.S. and he was going to show that pricing was normal. Well, so we priced a drug that was like the fourth or fifth to market.
You're talking about GSK right now, right?
Yes, I'm talking about GSK. Sorry. When I was the general counsel of GSK, Andrew Whitty, the new CEO, came in and said he was going to show that the U.S. and pricing was normal. Well, so we priced a drug that was like fifth to market, which had safety advantages by doing what you normally do when you're an entrant into a market. You price it lower. Well, nobody bought the drug because the rebates were lower because the price was lower. And so we didn't get, support from everybody who gets a rebate from the drug, and the drug failed. So it's just not, it's a crazy upside down, topsy-turvy world.
And just one final question before we get to generally FDA and pricing. In your experience, besides the normal elements that enter into a price, the research, the investment, the marketing, and all of that, how does it actually work within a company?
Well, I mean, you look at comparators, especially if there are existing products in the market. You look at those. You look at what you think the market will bear. You think, you look these days, you obviously look at the value, and there's a way to assess what the value of a medicine is in terms of the literal economic value that it provides. But at the end of the day, these are very commercial decisions, and I'll talk more about that. But it's a market-based system. But whatever the price is, it needs to allow the company to cover all of the failures that it's had that do not obviously get to market, which people seem not to realize.
Bethany, let me start talking about FDA with you here. We know that FDA cannot and does not approve products based on price, but obviously pricing pressure is a major factor in the way that companies develop products and interact with various elements. Can you talk a little bit about that, about the pricing pressures from a practical regulatory standpoint, from an FDA standpoint?
Absolutely. So I think the headline here really is that the label becomes a pricing asset. So under FDA rules, every word on the label is backed by data. You don't just put information onto the label unless the studies support it. And once something's there, it's very hard to pull it back, to change it, to update it. So the indication, the defined patient population, the clinical studies, all of these are not only required by regulation, and they're not regulatory niceties. They also become what the payers build their step therapy, their prior authorization, the formulary rules around. And so the label becomes really, really important. First, it shows up in how broad or narrow your indication is. A broad indication can give you much more pricing power and cleaner access. In a narrow, precise indication, while that might be really good science, it makes it harder for payers to figure out how to script it, how to think about prior authorization. They may require that you use other therapies first, that you go to failure before you can actually get access to that drug. And so when I'm sitting with teams and we're thinking about the process before submitting the NDA, and we're really looking at the commercial label, the questions are, what's the commercial reason for the label? What's the indication breadth? What's backed by evidence? And trying to think about how this is all going to play into the pricing component. We also see pricing showing up in the priority review vouchers. The Rare Pediatric Disease PRV program, which was reauthorized and will now go until at least September of 2029. The access through a voucher program is really important, creates its own pricing and competition-related mechanisms. They have high value. Historically, some of these have sold for up to over $300 million. Recently, we've been seeing them more in the $180 to $205 million range. But definitely vouchers, and thinking about the FDA option for vouchers is one that is a pricing pressure within the FDA regulatory scheme that can really be leveraged. And I guess the last thing is evidence package design. And Dan mentioned this earlier at the outset. The idea that we only have a default of just one pivotal trial now is going to be really complicated to think about when using one trial to speak to two different audiences, right? Designing your trial to meet the standard of substantial evidence within the FDA statute, but also be able to give CMS and other payers the information that they need in order to make pricing decisions, makes it, first of all, highly unlikely that you really can only use one trial. It's more likely that you have to do multiple different trials. But it also calls into question a lot of the other usage of data in those evidence packages. Real-world evidence framework, the recent guidance on the Bayesian models, these are all very relevant to thinking about how you're building your evidence package. And I do think that this flexibility in data, which is where we've been moving over the last couple of years, and in particular through some of the policies that Dan mentioned earlier, that flexibility also creates sort of a double-edged sword from a pricing perspective.
Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on that. Dan mentioned before that a lot of the policies that Dr. McCarty instituted are not in regulation. They're not even in guidances. They're in a YouTube video. One of them is a single trial policy. How do you advise a company today? And I'm going to ask both of you this. How do you advise a company today to do planning when so many variables are not in regulation or even in guidances? And a new commissioner could come in and say, "Gee, I don't think I think 3 trials are necessary to prove every drug. The law says you need adequate and well-controlled studies. I interpret that as being 3. What do you advise a client to do these days? Bethany, let me ask you that first, and then Dan.
I see sophisticated teams that have strong regulatory functions. They're really leaning in. They see these options like the expedited voucher, the commissioner's priority voucher, the new evidence standards that I mentioned, the idea of using non-animal methods. They want to be at the table, they want to lean in, and they want to take advantage of this. And so to your point, Wayne, how do you take advantage of something that might disappear within a certain time period that's not really formulated into a formalized legal process? And the way that we advise to do that is to make sure that you're documenting everything, documenting all of your discussions with FDA, not just your formal meetings, but your informal meetings, making sure that you have a really strong regulatory history package so that if the policy changes or if a new set of reviewers comes in with a different standard, you at least have the written evidence to show them what you've agreed to with that review team before, what it is that you've been doing in your own clinical program, and what the justification is for that, so that it's all tied down. But I agree, there's a lot of companies for which this regulatory churn is just really risky. As you mentioned, what FDA says today may not be what it's interpreted in 3 months or 3 years from now. And that has some really significant impact on deals and on transactions, whether or not that drug asset can be acquired later. These are things that we're talking about all the time with clients.
Dan, I ask you the same question, particularly in the context of pricing, because that's what we're talking about today, and addressing what advice do you have for your clients with regard to the way you do planning now with regard to pricing and FDA?
So I'm mostly an expert witness these days, which gives me the benefit of not having to advise clients in real time, because I think I'm often happy that I'm no longer the general counsel of GlaxoSmithKline and having to worry about current drug development because of the issues that you guys have just raised and that Bethany has raised. I think she mentioned what to me is the key. It's just the review team. Now, notwithstanding the turnover that there's still more stability in the review team level. And the problem I had with this, with many of these changes, is that change at FDA really, by and large, not entirely, but by and large, needs to go bottom up rather than top down. So if you've got a reviewer who thinks, sure, one clinical trial is enough here, particularly if it's like an oncology product, that's fine. But I would not be pushing on a reviewer saying, hey, look at this journal article that, and I wouldn't have done this even before McCary left. I wouldn't be pushing a reviewer who initially thinks there should be 2 or 3 to do one trial because of this journal article. I mean, if it's written in guidance, that's a different conversation. Certainly, if the rules were changed, that's a different conversation. But one of the disturbing things about this administration has been the political involvement in the drug review process. And historically, as you know, Wayne, the drug review process has not been politicized at all. I mean, basically, the political involvement sort of stopped, at a level above Janet Woodcock, right? And so the drug approval process was the province of science and the reviewers, and it didn't really shift administration to administration. That doesn't mean there weren't things that administrations changed in terms of policy, but the review process was, you just didn't have to worry that there was going to be a change in administration, and all of a sudden the special protocol assessment that you negotiated was no longer going to be operative. And that seemed to be starting to change in this administration, and that's really problematic. I think the only thing you can do is to pick up on what Bethany said. Work carefully with the review team, be open-minded to what they have to say, try and satisfy them, document it all, as she mentioned. It's really got to be a scientist to scientist, regulatory to regulatory conversation where everybody is confident that you're doing the right thing for the patient, notwithstanding the importance of also generating a medicine that will lead to profits, because if there's no market, there's no medicine.
Bethany, you mentioned before labeling as being so important. And what are the other flashpoints that arise in the pricing paradigm with regard to FDA? What are the other things that you have to take into account besides labeling?
I like this question because it allows us to go deep into some of the issues, including the real specifics of how we think about packaging, dosage form, the route of administration, 505(b)(2). This is the where the rubber meets the road, and using FDA regulatory strategies to impact pricing, and also making sure that you're aware of pricing issues as you're developing your regulatory file. As I mentioned before, the label is itself a pricing asset, and that is where we're starting from. When you then look at things like orphan exclusivity, Congress clarifying that orphan exclusivity is tied to the approved use or the indication and not just the disease category. Any single word in those indications in use can change your reimbursement story, the scope of the reimbursement, but also it can change your status as an orphan drug. And we do see companies that are litigating over label language or pursuing disputes with FDA because they know what the payers are going to want to see on the labels. And so those labeling discussions become really important. But the root of it, I think the biggest flashpoint is actually, and I dare say it's, dangerous to start getting into this discussion about most favored nation pricing. But historically, changing a route or dosage form where you would move from an IV to a subcutaneous, moving from, you could do 3 times a day to once daily. Those really were clinical or life cycle related questions for how you were developing the drug. And does it meaningfully impact the patient experience, the outcomes? And then does that change in the drug actually justify a pricing premium? And now we know globally, the U.S. administration's most favored nation, which we usually shorten to MFN initiative, is really explicitly about trying to align the U.S. prices with those in economically comparative markets. And so the proposed Medicare and Medicaid pilots are going to be benchmarking against the EU, UK, Japan, Canada, and then a few others. And what they're looking at is the same drug in those markets and then tying the U.S. reimbursement to the lowest price in that basket, the comparable basket. And this is where I think getting back to the regulatory basics in the FDA file really matters. That's where the dosage form and the packaging become a flashpoint. If you have one presentation in Europe that's a discounted price that's been negotiated by a local distribution partner, a lot of times this happens in distribution structures, is that you have different distributors in different jurisdictions. And then you have a different presentation of the drug in the U.S. The question under the MFN structure becomes, are those really different products? Or have you just packaged differently the same molecule? And is CMS going to treat that as the same drug? And then the lower ex-US price, which is typical, it's typically lower outside of the US, is that going to pull down your US price through the rebates, which Dan mentioned earlier, can be a real flashpoint in and of themselves. Same happens with pack size. So a smaller pack, different mixes of strength. Sometimes a drug company will put together like a hospital-only presentation. All of these things make for different SKUs, different ways of packaging the product, but are they actually the same drug? And is this a legitimate clinical or is this an operational way of putting it together in the labeling and the packaging? And I do think that the overlay of the MFN framework is becoming a benchmark and a flashpoint. It's not abstract. We're seeing clients who are rethinking these models, the out-licensing models, because they don't want to cede control in Europe or Japan to a partner if they think that those pricing approaches in those jurisdictions are going to drag down the U.S. price. And then you come back to the core regulatory issue, which is this the same product? Is this in the same presentation? Is it a different product? Do I have to do something different in the U.S. market? So we're seeing, especially in the last 6 to 10 months, a lot more of deep thinking on how pricing, especially impacted by this MFN model overlay as they're developing, is impacting what the regulatory strategy is for both the U.S. and for other markets.
Yeah, Dan, I know you're relieved to not have to think about flashpoints in terms of FDA, but let me ask you the same question. Do you have anything to add to what Bethany said? You get the final comment before we go to our break.
Sure. Again, when Andrew Whitty became the CEO of GSK, one of the things he said that was somewhat shocking to those of us who were FDA oriented was that he had zero interest in approvable drugs, and he was only interested in reimbursable drugs. And I think that is really the way drug developers need to and do think about things. One of the big debates that happens within big companies, and I'm talking about from the perspective of big pharma, is at what point should commercial be involved in R&D? There's this whole question about a handshake and when the handoff comes in. And the interesting thing, and maybe the outside counsel who are listening to this won't like to hear that very much, but it's very hard for them to be involved at, say, phase 2 of a medicine that's being developed inside a big pharma company. But this is where in-house counsel role is so important, because commercial considerations are being considered all along the way, even from target selection, as I alluded to earlier. And you need to make sure that you have those commercial considerations in mind, because again, as I said, if there's no market, there's no medicine. And I've seen medicines that were dropped because they weren't going to be adequately reimbursable. They weren't going to be commercially successful. They would have helped the patient, but they weren't. But they just weren't economically viable. You try and find an alternative home for those kinds of medicines, but that is a commercial reality. That said, you again have to be very careful to make sure that even as you attend to these commercial considerations, you are at no point compromising patient safety, because anytime your documents look like you put profits before patients, you can end up suffering long-term consequences, whether from government, from plaintiffs' lawyers down the road.
Okay, we're going to take a short break now. Don't go anywhere. We'll be right back. And we're back, talking with Bethany Hills from White Case, Dan Troy from BRG. Bethany, let me start the second half of this podcast with you. How should companies think about lawful product differentiation versus differentiation that may later be portrayed as, let's call it, regulatory gaming?
The way I frame this for clients is pretty simple, actually. Lawful product differentiation is grounded in science and patient value. And regulatory gaming is really timing and revenue. And those may have different results. On paper, they can look really similar. So I talked earlier about a new dosage form, a new indication, reformulation. But within the FDA file, within the development file, and also what's submitted to FDA and the paperwork surrounding it, we really can see what was being driven by a real clinical rationale and then what was being driven by a commercial or a profit-driven incentive. And this is where I actually spend a lot of my time doing this work, which is assessing FDA files and transactions. Definitely a sophisticated acquirer is going to see things in the FDA documentation that a pitch deck will never tell you. So if the differentiation story really is true, it's a clinical differentiation, or is this product development being used as you mentioned, regulatory gaming? And so when we diligence an asset, what we do is we look at the label negotiation history. Did the company actually push back for a broader indication? Did the data really support that? Was FDA pushing back? Was there some sort of a compromise? And that record tells us if the label is durable, is the label fragile, how exposed is the company if someone said you actually did this for commercial reasons or for anti-competitive reasons. And then we look at life cycle moves. So I mentioned earlier, orphan designations, pediatric plans. We look at 505(b)(2) applications, all of these different types of life cycle development strategies that are used. And they can either be considered lawful differentiation, as you mentioned, or product hopping, depending on what the science shows. And really, what the company says internally about this is what's going to define what the purpose is. And I think the stakes on this distinction are much higher now. FDA is making parts of the regulatory history more transparent. So the complete response letters that used to live quietly in paper files and we'd only see them in the transactional documentation, they'd come up in diligence, so we get a chance to get our eyes on them. Now a big amount of them have been released publicly. And so buyers, payers, competitors, a lot of folks can see what's going on and what's in that pattern. And so I do think that we're at a point now where, making this differentiation and really sticking to the clinical story is important and in the process.
Dan, there are a few other issues that we haven't talked about. We haven't talked about the role of drug shortages or the potential for drug shortages in pricing strategies. We haven't talked about CMC issues. How do some of those other issues that we haven't talked about play into a decision as to both how to set a price and how to interact with FDA?
Sure. Well, just a note to Bethany's earlier comment, which I completely agree with. Finally, a citizen petition has been filed challenging the FDA's unilateral and, to me, unexplained, and I'm not sure legally supportable decision to just make public all of these complete response letters, which have historically been considered to be replete with confidential commercial information. So that seems to me to be an extremely vulnerable decision that the Cary FDA made. I mean, transparency is good, but not all transparency is good in all cases. And particularly if it illegally discloses confidential commercial information, that's an issue that I think took too long to litigate, but I think it will get litigated. Turning to your question, I mean, there are obviously two markets, right? There's the branded companies, and for branded companies, I don't think that CMC issues, are that. Obviously, you need to get your CMC right, but the efficiency is different than it is for generics, and the extent that you run into a shortage in the branded space, it's because, for example, in the GLP-1s or in Shingrix, the demand exceeds the supply, which is kind of a nice problem to have. The real problem with shortages is the fact that historically CMS has and the insurers have not adequately reimbursed or paid generics for very complicated products that they've made.
Bethany, one final question in this area, and that has to do with documentation. What should companies document internally when they make regulatory and product presentation decisions that may later be second-guessed through a pricing lens?
I have a lot to say about documentation. Actually, I did want to pull on a thread on what Dan had mentioned about CMC issues, just to hammer this point home, is that I think that chemistry manufacturing control issues is probably one of the most underweighted diligence areas that we see in the transactional context. I have seen so many, countless painful surprises come from manufacturing issues, unresolved 483s, repeat warning letters, deeply hidden and not resolved quality culture issues that are going to make a deal or a transaction really painful in the future. Unfortunately, I sit as an outside counsel in the place where I get to see both sides of this, those selling and those buying, and all of the painful divorces that can happen as a result of these issues. And it is something that you can't overemphasize, that when you're doing in a transactional context, to really be paying attention to those manufacturing issues, because they are tied into the expedited speed, and speed leads to pricing. And I know we are probably covering way too much ground here, but I was thinking about that FDA pre-check program and the idea, to have another one of the policies that FDA has put out in the last 18 months, to have a process for new facilities to really encourage domestic manufacturing, and to do that through a faster inspection review process. So that's another thing that's going to play into all of the pricing. On your question about documentation, I do think that this is the thread that ties a lot of things together. Usually, all of these different issues that we've talked about, your development issues, the life cycle issues, the regulatory strategies that you put together, they end up in the FDA record, the official record that goes in, that's part of your file, it's what's approved, and then you also have this information in your internal documents. And ultimately, your internal documents are what may be subject to further government investigations, antitrust issues, or investigations in the future, or in a transactional context, although we don't, in a transaction, get so deep into like reading emails back and forth between commercial folks about what their reasoning is for doing a 505(b)(2) as opposed to sticking with the same formulation. But I do think the advice really is, if you're thinking about your FDA file, the FDA expects your scientific and regulatory rationales, and you have to take your position, make it based in science, and stick to that, and make sure that you've documented when the decision is made and that you're not trying to reconstruct it later. On the FDA meetings, and I mentioned this earlier, you really need to carefully review those meeting minutes. You have to correct them. You have to make sure that inaccurate meeting minutes will come back and be a problem later. And what was said in the room needs to be accurately reflected. And we do need to make sure that that gets documented and is in the file. We've talked about labeling. We haven't really talked much in this discussion about REMS and shared systems, but documenting your safety rationale for your REMS program is really important, so that you can make a case for why the REMS program is needed clinically, why it's a risk mitigation program, and that it's not there on purpose to delay a generic entry into the market, but it's there actually for the safety and mitigation reason that FDA is looking for. And I think I'll just mention at the end here that the FDA file that we look at in this transactional context, or even in developing them, this isn't just a regulatory document anymore. I do think that what goes into your meeting discussions, the development in your clinical program is becoming more and more a legal, a commercial, and an enforcement-related document set. So they are really important.
Yeah, so I want to pick up on and agree with everything that Bethany said, but add one additional point, and that is, I think some of you may know that in California, there is this theory developing of failure to innovate, where a company is being held liable for failing to innovate and replace a drug that is itself still an FDA-approved drug. And so what this theory, and we hope it's overturned, augurs is the plaintiff's bar potentially going into your R&D pipeline decisions way back, because this is about basically a phase 1, phase 2 asset, about what to progress and what not to progress. And I think one needs to be very careful about what your documentation looks like, because you just have to assume in terms of transparency that anything anybody is writing down is going to be at some point reviewed by, let's just say, hostile forces.
Right. Well, on that note, let's bring this to a conclusion. This has been a fascinating discussion. I've learned a lot of good perspectives. I was going to ask you about skinny labeling, the recent decision, but we'll leave that for another podcast. Dan, you've identified still more subjects for a podcast, a lot to discuss in the FDA area. So let me thank Bethany and Dan for being such great guests. I want to thank our partner for this series, White Case and BRG. And I want to thank also our podcast creator and executive producer, Michael Evan Epstein, assistant producer, Sam Hoffmeister. I want to remind everybody that our website is fdawatch.net. And if you don't want to miss parts 3 and 4 of this series, or if you want to go back and listen to part 1 or any other episodes that we've had, you can go to fdawatch.net. And what you will be asked to do is to subscribe. It's very simple. It's free. You just put in your email address and you press subscribe, and you will get emails whenever we post a new episode. Podcast, FDA Watch, is really growing exponentially. And that's because so many of you have chosen to be subscribers. I do want to point out one differentiation. A lot of people are following us on LinkedIn, but have not subscribed. And there is a difference between following us and subscribing. You subscribe by going to fdawatch.net, and then you'll get an email. If you follow us, then you don't get that email. So it really pays to invest the extra 15 seconds to go to fdawatch.net and actually subscribe. Hope to see you next time. As we say at the end of every episode of FDA Watch, if you really want to watch what FDA is doing, listen to FDA Watch. This is Wayne Pines.